Welcome everyone to this session of the Ex-Religious Support Network. Our guest speaker tonight is Caroline Winzenried, and Caroline's back after quite a spell. She ran a series of 4 talks back in 2021 and 2022. It was a series on religious trauma, and the first one was in June 2021, which was a general overview, the hidden toll of religious trauma. And then in September, she spoke on the persistence of purity culture. And then in November, she spoke on identity and relationships. And then in February 2022, she spoke on religious trauma, the eternal sinner. And then her final one in that series was in March of 2022 on religious trauma, making sense of existence. So I'm really pleased to get Caroline back again for what will be a series of 3 talks. Tonight is the first one on various aspects of emotions and religion. So tonight's talk is titled The Emotional Landscape of Religion, Emotions as Good or Bad. Now, I think the second in this series will be on spiritual bypassing, disconnecting from emotions. And the third one in the series will be reconnecting with emotions, the power of curiosity. I hope I've got that right, Caroline. Yeah, because it may be subject to adjustment. Okay, so let me say a little about Caroline before she starts her talk. Caroline Winzenried is a counsellor in Boronia, Victoria, here in Australia. She works from an existential humanistic lens with individuals across the lifespan, from adolescent to older adults, on issues including anxiety, depression, and interpersonal relationships. Her areas of special interest include working with religious trauma and grief and loss. So with that, I'll hand over to Caroline. Thank you, Caroline.
Thanks, Liz, for that introduction, and thank you everyone for having me back here tonight. It's really nice to be back here and to see some familiar faces. And it's been a while since I last presented, so bear with me with this screen sharing as I get this up, but I'm looking forward to sharing this presentation with you. So as Les said, I am Caroline Winzenried, and I am a counsellor specializing in religious trauma, working in the Boronia area. And tonight we'll be starting the 3-part series of looking at emotions, their importance, and what can happen when we become disconnected from them or disown them. And we'll be beginning tonight by taking a look at how different religions conceptualize emotions and the different messages that people take away from that. And to give you an overview of kind of the basics of what we'll be covering tonight, we're going to be starting with defining emotions to make sure that we know what they are before we get started. And then we'll take a look at what do religious canons have to say about them. Finally, we'll take a look at how different religious communities tend to interpret these messages and what kind of impact this has on people's relationships to their emotions. So we'll begin by defining emotions. Emotions are often brief, intense reactions to different events and stimuli. This may sound like quite a dry definition of them compared to what we often hear in literature, the humanities, music, where we might describe emotion as a feeling or a state, or we might even describe it by what we feel in our body, a burning feeling of anger, or a lightheaded feeling of anxiety. But I'd like to break it down with some of the most important components of emotion that are often found in various theories of emotion. It's important to mention that there are actually several different theories of emotion, but we'll be kind of condensing these theories tonight into what are generally agreed upon to be some of the important components that define them. First of all, we have perception. So this is our 5 senses. This is the way that we perceive the events and stimuli around us. It also involves a cognitive appraisal. This takes into account our worldviews, our judgments, our motivations, and we engage in a meaning-making process to interpret the stimuli or the event that has just occurred. There is a physiological response, which occurs as well. And this can be any sort of bodily response, like sweating or a racing heart, or even laughter. There's also a behavioral response. This is what you do with the emotion, and this can be internal or external. You might shout if you're angry, you might ruminate if you're feeling anxious, and this can involve a lot of different facial expressions as well. And again, there are many different frameworks for understanding emotion, particularly in the field of mental health. But one example that I've included here to the left is Plutchik's Wheel of Emotion. And this is a very popular model which conceives of kind of a category of basic emotions that you can see in that most colorful area in the center there. This is what he conceptualizes to be our primary emotions. And you can see that they have opposite sides. In his concept, vigilance, for example, is the opposite of amazement. Ecstasy is the opposite of grief. As you get further to the outside of this kind of flower diagram, you see that there's less intensity. And in between these petals, you can see what he conceives of as combinations of these emotions. So I'd like to highlight here some key features of emotions that I think are quite important. The first one is that they're reactionary. Our emotions don't come out of nowhere. They're always in response to something that we've experienced. And the other factor is that they're informational. Emotions are actually really important sources of information. The cognitive appraisals that we have to make sense of the stimuli in our outside world often happen at a subconscious level. Emotions help us gain access to some of these meaning-making systems that may be happening behind the scenes. They also can clue us in to how others are interpreting a situation. For example, if I say something to someone and they respond with a raised voice, I may be able to learn from their anger that perhaps they feel disrespected by what I've just said to them. Importantly, emotions help clarify what our goals are and what's important to us. When we respond to something, we're undergoing that meaning-making system, and that can highlight what kind of values we have and what might need to change. We see this often with anger. People note that anger can be kind of taking in when you feel disrespected or a boundary has been crossed. And that can be really important information in figuring out what kind of boundaries do I want to set. We're going to take a look now at how emotion shows up in some of the foundational texts and teachings of religion. Now, I'd like to cover as many as possible, but for the sake of time, we're going to be focusing tonight on Christianity and Buddhism as a case study. Now, the reason that I've chosen these two is that they're quite different, and I hope that this will not only provide an interesting contrast, but will also illustrate that even quite different religions can have an impact on how we connect to our emotions or disconnect to them. And I'm going to start here with some passages from the Bible that are just a small sampling of what the Bible has to say about emotion, but I think that they highlight some of this strong language and the often contradictory nature of how these emotions are presented. As I read these passages, I invite you to reflect on what kind of messages you take from them, including how you feel about the language that's used in them, and how you might feel about your own emotions after reading them, and also wondering how you think you're supposed to feel about your emotions from these passages' guidance. And I'll start with these passages on the left here that are regarding anger. From Ephesians, we have, "Be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger, and give no opportunity to the devil. From Psalms we have, refrain from anger and forsake wrath. Fret not yourself, it tends only to evil. On the right, we have passages about jealousy. Deuteronomy says, "They have made me jealous with what is no God. They have provoked me to anger with their idols." From James, we have, "For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder and every vile practice." And something you may have noticed here is that that quote from Deuteronomy is actually God speaking, which is quite interesting to note that even God is shown as being not only angry, but also jealous in the Bible. I find this quite striking because as we try to make sense of how we should feel and relate to our emotions, we get some very strong messages with some very high stakes language here. We're told that anger might be a sin, that it might be giving opportunity to the devil, and that it can lead to evil. We're also told some pretty strongly worded things about jealousy, and yet we see God being jealous and angry throughout the Bible. As you consider that, I wonder what kind of messages can be taken away from this somewhat contradictory selection of passages that we have here. Next, we'll take a look at sadness and fear in the Bible. And again, you can see some of that very strong language here, as well as some contradictory messages. And I'll start with the left side, which includes 2 passages on sadness, beginning with Psalms. "Those who sow in tears shall reap with shouts of joy." And from 2 Corinthians, "For godly grief produces a repentance that leads to salvation without regret, whereas worldly grief produces death." On the right here, we have some messages about fear. We're going to start with Joshua. "Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened and do not be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go." And from Proverbs, "The fear of the Lord leads to life, and whoever has it rests satisfied. He will not be visited by harm." Again, we have some strong language. We have some direct commands, a command to be strong, a command not to be frightened. And yet we are also told that fear of God leads to life, and that it's important that we have fear. With sadness, there is a message here that sadness will be rewarded with joy. But we are also told that we need to be very careful about our sadness, that it can be dangerous because worldly grief produces death. Again, we see some very high stakes language being used here. And if you were trying to make sense of all of these contradictory messages, I'll just add to some confusion here by covering the 7 deadly sins. Now, depending on your framework, some of these, like gluttony or lust, wouldn't actually be classified as emotions. However, when we take a closer look, we can understand them through the lens of an emotion like desire. And as you look at this list, what does this tell you about how Christianity values anger, jealousy, pride, and desire? How do we reconcile that with some of those passages that we just read? We're going to switch gears now and take a look at emotion in the Buddhist canon. Again, as we explore emotion in Buddhism, think about what kind of messages around emotions you might take away from these teachings. So one foundational principle of Buddhism that's quite central to its teachings are the 4 Noble Truths, and these include the following ideas. The first is that suffering is an inherent part of our life on earth. The second is that suffering comes from ignorance and attachment. We don't understand the true nature of things, and so we respond inappropriately with our senses to stimuli in the world. We have deceptive senses and a warped understanding. This causes us to be excessively attached, wanting more and more of things we desire as pleasant, and wanting to escape from and deny things we regard as unpleasant. The third principle is that there is a way to end our suffering by achieving enlightenment. And the fourth is that we can reach enlightenment by following principles outlined in the Eightfold Path. And notice, as we reflect on these teachings, that there's an emphasis in Buddhist teachings not on which particular emotions are good or bad, but rather how intensely we should feel them. And interestingly, this opens up the possibility that perhaps any emotion could be bad in too much excess. Another core principle is that of the four sublime states. These include loving kindness, or a state of loving others without desire, judgment, or attachment; compassion, feeling for others and being moved by their suffering; sympathetic joy, happiness shared in community and connection; and equanimity, a calm, unshakable balance of mind. And as we take this all in, what do these principles tell us about what's valued here? What are some emotions connected to these four sublime states? I find myself wondering if perhaps joy and grief are touched on here. Is it desirable to be joyous and to grieve if they're in the context of compassion and sympathetic joy? How do we know how much joy and grief we should experience? After taking a look at some of the foundational teachings of these two religions, we notice that there is some very strong, high-stakes language around various emotions, but that there are also a lot of contradictions that make it challenging to form a cohesive framework for how to respond and feel about our own emotions. And yet, because of that language used, it feels very important that we should find a way to relate to our emotions, lest we fall astray of those religions' teachings. This is where community beliefs and teachings come in. Different branches and denominations of religions form their own ideas about what these core teachings mean. Even within the same denomination, different communities form their own belief systems and frameworks. We'll take a look here at what some of those belief systems look like. So two researchers, Kim Prieto and Diener, summarize this relationship between religion and emotions like this. The desirability of different emotions, the preferred level of intensity, and methods wherein the desirable emotions can be experienced at the preferred level appear to be part and parcel of religious traditions. And this is going to be a big slide, but I think it's important to spend some time here. From the research that's been done on this, we know that pride is viewed as an undesirable emotion in Christian populations. But I'd like to add a few other emotions that often come up in qualitative interviews and in my own work with clients. Jealousy is often seen kind of unconditionally as undesirable, and we see this both in the Christian world and often in the secular world. Many people feel that it's never okay to feel jealous, and that jealousy is always sinful. And I'll save this deep dive for a later presentation, but I think you may be surprised to find that there are actually some benefits to listening to jealousy when it comes up inside of us, and that even jealousy can have some important information for us. Anger is also often maligned, particularly in Christian communities, but sometimes even in secular communities as well. It's a particular challenge for Christians to feel comfortable with their anger, however, because of the emphasis on teachings such as turn the other cheek, which sometimes lead to beliefs that it's not only unacceptable to display anger, but it's unacceptable to even feel it or to acknowledge that it exists within us. Desire is typically tied to concepts such as the 7 deadly sins, whether that's lust, gluttony, or greed. Sometimes people feel that desire is okay in certain circumstances, for example, where they are socially sanctioned physical desires for a spouse, but others see desire as wholly bad, fearsome, and to be avoided. Now, you may be surprised to see grief on this list. Often we think of grief as an expression of love and compassion, particularly when it's about a person that we've lost that we care about. But several beliefs can make this emotion actually feel sinful for Christians. For example, some people believe it's wrong for me to grieve because this was God's plan. Or they might believe they're in a better place now, so I shouldn't be sad. If I'm sad, that means I'm not trusting God to take care of them in heaven. A particular flavor of this can also be seen in the evangelical community, where a strong emphasis is placed on showing non-Christians the joy of Christian life. There can be a belief there that I need to hide my sadness and my grief because it's my responsibility as a Christian to show people the joy of living in Christ. Similar beliefs underlie an avoidance or an aversion to fear, including the belief that if I believe in God and God's power, then I shouldn't be afraid. Any fear is a sign that I don't trust in Him and His plan for me. And I wonder if we can trace that back to one of those passages that we read earlier, that perhaps that passage may be an important part of what this person learned in their faith. Joy can be another surprise for people, and I think it's an excellent illustration of the large role that communities play in shaping beliefs around biblical teachings of emotions. For evangelicals, joy is often a responsibility. But in some communities' belief systems, joy and happiness are signs that a person is not fully engaged with the battle against sin. In such a worldview, there is no room for joy or happiness in the life of a righteous person. I'd like to share a couple quotes here from women who had tried to disown various emotions in response to the messages that they were taught about them. I think that these two accounts really highlight how diverse and how polarized these messages can be and how they can influence people's experiences with their emotions. In this first quote, a woman speaks about her struggles with accepting her anger. She says, "When I was a teenager, I wasn't allowed to experience anger or sadness because that was just evidence that you're giving in to the devil and him wanting you to feel that way, not having joy in the Lord." In this second quote, a different woman speaks about her struggle with happiness and not only making a place for it in her life, but also even being able to identify it. "I didn't even know what happiness was. Happiness was a sign that you are on the wrong path, because if you're happy, then things were too easy, and things are only too easy when you're giving into your sinful nature." Now, this list may look quite familiar to that slide we just saw back there. But while we see that all of these emotions here are the same as the ones on the Christian side, I'd like to point out that they're seen as undesirable for very different reasons in Buddhism. In excess, any of these emotions, and probably other emotions too, can be a sign of attachment, which takes the Buddhist further away from achieving enlightenment. It isn't so much about the specific nature of any of these emotions, the way it is in Christianity, but rather it is about the intensity that these emotions can bring. I read an account somewhere of a woman who, during a Q&A section of a workshop, asked the moderator if it was all right for her to cry for her cat who had just died. It struck me as such an interesting illustration of how difficult It can be to navigate emotions in Buddhism. You could frame her tears as compassion, one of the four sublime states. But alternatively, as she worried about in her question, you could frame it as a sign of attachment. I'd like to share with you a quote from a man who saw his sadness and depression this way, as a form of attachment from which to rid himself. He says, "There was still this underlying agenda, this hope that if I meditate, I won't have to feel any of this depression. I thought, these feelings are not supposed to be here. That not only undermined the ability of these feelings to arise and pass, but it actually added to the secondary story of I'm not doing my practice well enough because I'm feeling sadness, I'm feeling grief, I'm feeling confusion." And he touches on something very important here, which is that when we disconnect from our emotions, when we try to push them down or make them go away, we actually inhibit our natural response to be able to move through and respond to them. Oftentimes, we may believe that it's possible to control our emotions by getting rid of them, pushing them down, or changing them. But emotions actually don't go away until you can see them, until you can listen to them and to respond to them. And this is the source of a lot of confusion and is a real struggle for people who are trying to get rid of them this way with some of these religious teachings and practices. And we actually have a word for this. It was coined by a Buddhist, and the term is spiritual bypassing. What this refers to is when we try to avoid, disown, or distract from emotions. And often this happens through ways that are particular to different religious traditions. You can see some of these methods here in prayer and meditation. And we'll be covering this more specifically in future presentations, but I just wanted to give you a bit of a peek here at what some of these methods look like. And certainly some people find that they can cope with their emotions and move through them if they use some of these techniques. But what we often find happens is that people use these techniques instead to avoid and get rid of these emotions. And that in fact, those emotions don't go anywhere at all. They're still there and they still need to be addressed. In this presentation, we've laid the groundwork for how religion approaches emotions, both in foundational teachings and in community teachings and beliefs. In the next two parts of this series, we'll take a look at what happens when we engage in spiritual bypassing and disconnect from our emotions. And we'll also take a look at how to reconnect with them and why that's so important. The topic of emotions and spiritual bypassing can bring up a lot for people. I also recognize that I've read aloud several Bible passages today, and that this can be quite triggering for people. If you find yourself feeling lost, overwhelmed, or hopeless about what we've talked about today, I encourage you to reach out for some extra support. Talking to others who have had similar experiences, whether it's in the context of a support group or a trusted friend, can be a powerful resource. Being able to tell your story and listen to others' stories is often an integral part of healing. It can also be helpful to explore your emotions in therapy, where a trained therapist can help you to identify, make sense of, and reconnect with emotions that you may find yourself struggling to make room for. And that's all from me for tonight. Thank you for having me, and I hope that you'll join me for the next two parts in the series.
Oh, thank you very much, Caroline. You've really highlighted for me how religions work to suppress emotions, and I think you've highlighted really well the important work therapists like yourself do in allowing people to work through those emotions. So that was really enlightening for me. One part I really did like was us mere mortal human beings are not allowed to have emotions. The only being that's allowed to have even some of those emotions considered a part of vice is the divine being. He or she is allowed to be angry and jealous and all that kind of thing. That's for the divine beings. So please join me in thanking Caroline. And I believe the next session is going to be, as you mentioned, on spiritual bypassing, disconnecting from emotions. So I hope you all can join us for that. For previous sessions, podcasts, slides, videos, go to my rationalrealm.com website. That's rationalrealm.com, and go to the resources section and you'll find them there. And the video for this should be coming out shortly as well. Thank you.